Welcome, everyone. My name is Pirooz Kalayeh. We are here in Conversations, Art and Cinema. Our esteemed guest is Wago Kreider, Associate Professor here at the School of Media Arts at Southern Illinois University, Carbondale. He is a media artist and experimental filmmaker. His creative work engages with contemporary strategies of artistic reenactment, the reconstruction of cinematic history, and the impact of film history on our perceptions of landscape and the environment. His films have screened at the Museum of Modern Art in New York, the Rotterdam International Film Festival, the London Film Festival, the Corcoran Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C., the Hong Kong Film Festival, views from the Avant-Garde of the New York Film Festival, the European Media Art Festival in Osnabrück, Germany, the Paris Festival of Different and Experimental Cinema, and at the International Film Festival of Vienna. He has participated in artist residencies at the Experimental Television Center in Owego, Harvestworks Digital Media Arts Center in New York City, Basement Films Experiments in Cinema in Albuquerque, and at the Berlinale Talents as part of the Berlin International Film Festival. Let's give a warm welcome for Professor Kreider. Thank you so much for joining us. It is a pleasure for you to be here with us, our very own. And I'm so excited to dive into all of these films. And I know that the students have a lot of questions, and I have a lot of questions myself. Such sophisticated cinema that really moves and is haunting at the same time for me. I'm overwhelmed with emotion a lot of times when I'm watching, to the point where I need to stop at moments and then sort of take a breath and come back to it. But oftentimes I find that that type of experience is probably the most exhilarating for me. And when I visited your class, we did talk briefly about Abbas Kiarostami. And one thing that, and I know you're familiar with his work as well, his sort of trajectory was sort of starting with documentaries, doing children's videos, then having a career doing narrative film, then moving towards mixing hybrids. And then finally, he became, this fine artist, this video artist, this experimental avant-garde artist. And he said he was always trying to push the art form further and to get it to a point which you have arrived at right from the onset. You sort of just hit it. And sort of the first question I want to ask you before we get into Marvelous Creatures is, how did you sort of know that that was going to be where you wanted to go right away? Because I know you had a history with the Yes Men. I know you had a history before that with sort of doing straight narrative stuff. How did you jump into the fine art stuff, and how did you find a way to sort of get so comfortable with it so quickly in your career?
Thank you, Pirooz, for inviting me. I really am glad to be here. And to answer your question, like how I ended up doing experimental oriented work right from the beginning, it had to do with my original training. When I originally went to college, I had a dream of going to Hollywood and becoming a film director, like many people in film school do. But I was born and raised in San Diego, Southern California. And I ended up doing my undergraduate training in media arts at the University of California over in La Jolla, there in San Diego. And I didn't know it at the time. It was a very unconventional media arts training. I did a degree in their visual arts program. They had just started a new media arts track. And the visual arts program there at UC San Diego had an orientation toward conceptual art practice. At that time, a number of artists were teaching there who were coming out of fluxus and performance-based practices, conceptual art, minimalism. And that sort of provided the foundation for my understanding of what art and cinema could be, what it was capable of doing. And that sort of has stuck with me my whole life. And so after I finished my undergraduate degree, I started looking at grad programs. And I realized that the training that I had at UC San Diego was very unusual, to say the least, that it really wasn't a way for preparing me for work in conventional narrative cinema. So by that time, I had already had a glimpse or a taste of pushing the cinematic medium to its extreme and like finding novel, innovative ways of not only working with cinematic mediums, but also thinking about different ways of approaching cinematic thinking that borrowed from other disciplines like music, art, theater, dance, and very importantly, literature, literary forms. So right from the beginning, I was sort of exposed to different ways of thinking about cinematic making. I then started doing a lot of social activist video. This was sort of in the early 90s and was in a program at the University at Buffalo. And at that time, several of the sort of so-called visionary filmmakers were teaching there, including Tony Conrad, Paul Sheritz, Jerry O'Grady, who had started a media study program in Buffalo, had basically populated this program with all of these experimental filmmakers who had made their reputation in the 60s and 70s. So again, I was just sort of exposed with this unusual way of working. But at that time, the so-called visionary film way of filmmaking was going out of style. And there were new ways of working with media that were much more pressing. And so that's why I became much more involved in social activist, political filmmaking and collaborative filmmaking practices. It wasn't until I went back to school many years later, after a period of time in San Francisco where I was working in broadcast and corporate video production. I went back to grad school and I decided I'm done with commercial video production. I want to get back into what brought me into media in the first place, which was a love of experimentation, of self-expression, and of finding different ways of communicating with time-based media that sort of broke down the rigid conventions of traditional narrative cinema. I always have had a love of narrative cinema. I'm sort of a cinephiliac. And I have a master's in film studies from Berkeley. So that love of film history sort of dovetailed with my interest in experimental approaches to film and provided sort of the foundation for the content that I'm most interested in. And much of my work deals with the sort of legacy of Hollywood cinema, most obviously in the soundtracks that I appropriate and use as sort of the sonic or acoustic bed on which I create original and sometimes combining original with appropriated material. So I don't know if that answers your question, but that just gives you an idea of where I'm coming from, sort of the background context.
Oh, I think it was the perfect answer. And it sort of doesn't go into exactly marvelous creatures, but it makes me think about Vienna of the Desert.
Vienna in the Desert, that has the soundtrack from Johnny Guitar.
Yeah.
Yeah, Vienna in the Desert was shot at the Salton Sea, just east of San Diego. I've always had a love of Johnny Guitar, and that particular lover's discourse that takes place near the end of Johnny Guitar has always stuck in my mind. There's something very magical and haunting about this argument that this couple have about a relationship that could have happened, that could have taken place many years earlier. So it's sort of dripping with sort of a nostalgia for a relationship that never really got off the ground, that never took place. And this location just east of San Diego, the Salton Sea, sort of captures, for me, the essence of that feeling of loss, the loss of a potential incredible relationship between the two primary characters in Johnny Guitar. And also, as I had mentioned earlier, I'm really interested in how the soundtracks of classic films, classic Hollywood cinema, sort of provides sort of a cultural touchstone, almost sort of like an unconscious that we take with us in our daily experience. It sort of provides a frame for how we understand our world. It creates sort of like the structure for how we see the world and how we understand the world. So that soundtrack.
It's almost like when we're driving along and we get a certain scent and that helps us get a memory. Or when we hear a song, then that connects us to our memories. But for you, you're also connecting those famous lines that suddenly we hear it. Or we hear that soundtrack and then we're connected with that place, right?
Exactly.
Now, how does the process for something like this work, right? Are you coming up with the images first? Are you coming up with the soundtrack first? Is it mostly a piece that's created in the edit? Is it something that you're sort of you're visualizing and you're dreaming all up even before it comes, you know?
Yeah, great question, Pirooz. It depends on the project. It's generally a very organic process in terms of how a project comes together for me. Often I'm reading material that strikes me, so I'm already sort of like primed for a particular type of approach to a project, certain themes or ideas that I want to investigate. But ultimately, I'm really responding to location or place. So the landscape or the architecture that I shoot in really sort of initially drives a lot of my projects. I'm very much sort of sensitive to the specific location that I'm shooting in. In this sort of project that we're looking at right now, Between Two Deaths, I've always had a real interest in Hitchcock's Vertigo. And at the time, I was living in San Francisco, and Mission Dolores in the Mission District of San Francisco still exists. This is where the graveyard scene from Hitchcock's Vertigo was shot. And I would often visit this location and stroll around the graveyard among the gravestones, thinking about and remembering Hitchcock's film. And I realized after some time hanging out there that I wanted to work with that space. Initially, when I come into a project, I don't sort of script out exactly what it is that I want to do. There's an initial sort of process of collecting imagery and sounds that might take an extended period of time, sometimes months or years, where I collect imagery from a particular location. And then I sift through that material and decide, how I'm going to work with it. In this case, Between Two Deaths, I had an idea for sort of a reenactment of this scene. And so what I did is I reconstructed, shot by shot, every shot that Hitchcock and his crew shot at Mission Dolores for this graveyard scene. I had a recording of Vertigo that I brought with me that I would play back, and I would be able to see and get an idea of exactly where Hitchcock had placed his camera. And so I tried to recreate or reconstruct to the best of my ability exactly how this film was shot, basically reenacting it or rebuilding it from scratch. In some cases, I was able to mimic the shot almost exactly. The existing architecture, the surrounding landscape, the graveyard were preserved and were exactly the way they were when Hitchcock shot it in the 50s. In other cases, time has brought changes to the environment. For example, there is a gift shop adjoining the original Mission Dolores structure that didn't exist when Hitchcock was there. Also later in this film, when Hitchcock was there, there was a sort of a stone wall, a grotto area that has since been knocked down. So that's missing. So I was really interested in the change to the environment, to the architecture over time. And also how the ghosts of cinema past sort of inhabit the present space that we live in. That's something that I immediately felt, in my strolls through Mission Dolores and the surrounding graveyard, was sort of like this haunting of Hitchcock's spirit within the space. So I went back, I reconstructed or reenacted this scene from Hitchcock to the best of my ability, including all the camera movements, the tracking shots, the dolly shots. And in some cases, there's a perfect matching of both the past and the present. But I think in that sort of in-between zone, where there's a transition from one space and one time to the next, that's what I'm most interested in that slippage between past and present, between the ghost cinema past and the present moment.
I really love this idea of the in-betweens. I think that's similar between our works. We're looking for the in-betweens, and maybe that's why we have such an affinity for one another. I'm also curious, you said something about that you actually had this soundtrack playing as you were going through each space. So it was almost like your process, you had to have it, you had to hear it as you saw it as well. So the sound was equally as important as the image or the architecture when you were going through. So sound is right up there with you when you're constructing. It doesn't go one without the other.
That's true. I think that there's sort of a performative dimension to this filmmaking, especially in terms of reenactment. Reenactment of these classic films from the 50s, from Hollywood's golden era, and also the soundtrack. As I'd mentioned earlier, there is sort of a haunting that's taking place when we hear these soundtracks divorced from their original image. In some cases, we can identify the source. In other cases, they're familiar to us, but we can't quite put our finger on where their origin is. So yes, the soundtrack is extremely important to me, and it almost provides sort of like a background rhythm or ambiance for the production in real time at these locations. This is really interesting, this particular transition from past to present. Carla Valdez is an imaginary character in Hitchcock's original film that the character played by Jimmy Stewart is trying to track, trying to pin down, as it were. And in the location, the graveyard where Carla Valdez's gravestone is located, there is now this new gravestone exactly in that same location. And so there's these strange discrepancies between past and present. In some cases, the gravestones are completely missing, which is very odd, since this is a real graveyard. It's not a set. So that brings up questions about what may or may not have happened over the past 50 years in this space.
And that brings us to the other major element of your work, which is this sort of blend between reality and fiction, what's real and what's not, which seems to be a major theme in your work. And I'm going to try and get Marvelous Creatures now, like we planned.
Marvelous Creatures, again, is coming out of my love of cinematic history, specifically how actors and figures from popular culture, as embodied in cinematic history, sort of haunt our memories. Some of this footage was shot at Madame Tussauds Wax Museum in Manhattan. It was combined, the imagery from the Wax Museum of past Hollywood stars like Elvis Presley or Marilyn Monroe. That imagery was interspersed and intercut with footage that I shot at the Bronx Zoo on black and white 16mm film. And also taxidermied animals at the Museum of Natural History in New York. So there's three sort of main sources of material that are interspersed with appropriated material taken from 1950s melodramas. And it's sort of came out of this interest in comparing the mating rituals of animals to those of humans that I had previously explored in another piece with a similar structure called To Hug You and Squeeze You. In this case, I was really interested in exploring the ambiguity between the still image and the moving image. There's a play here between still images and the creation or the production of the illusion of movement, which sort of maps onto a confusion between the animate and the inanimate, the living and the dead, the biological and the mechanical, love and death. So there's a series of sort of conceptual oppositions that are at play here that are sort of represented in this back and forth oscillation between formal and conceptual elements, between black and white imagery and color imagery, between animals and humans, between machines and living creatures, between living animals, living, breathing animals, and taxidermied animals that are placed in a landscape, a painted landscape, creating the illusion of reality. And that's what cinema is all about. It's the creation of a living reality through fixed, inanimate images. And so on some level, this piece is really a meditation about cinema itself and how it functions, and sort of the dynamic oppositions that are at play in any film.
So we have both the challenges and breaks in conventions that you're doing editorially, but you also have this conceptual idea of finding the in-betweens in the in-betweens. So from each film to the next, you're looking again, well, what are the next in-betweens that we can find? So I love that you're taking the theme and you're launching into it again, into the next space. And I'm just curious whether or not, was this connected at all? You mentioned literature, right? And so you said you went to Buffalo. So I know literature was very big in Buffalo. How was it connected to literature, and was it ever connected?
I think I had a really amazing professor when I was at UC San Diego who introduced me to French cinema and literature. I think it was a class on French New Wave. We saw, the classics like Godard's, Breathless, Truffaut's early work. But also in that same class, I was introduced to the French New Wave authors at the time, like Alain Robbe-Grillet, who were really exploring new ways of working with the novel, new conceptions of how a novel could be written. And in that sort of understanding or that exploration of sort of exploding the conventions of the novel form, I also sort of was thinking, well, how could I do this with cinema? You know, how could I take these sort of uh, explorations and these discoveries that were being done in the 50s and 60s among the French New Wave novelists, and sort of use that as inspiration for a way of thinking about and working with time-based, image-based media.
I have a question, Wago.
Yes. Hi,
Hi,
Aaron.
how are you?
Doing well, thank you.
When I was watching your short about the repeating pictures, it reminds me of I don't know if you're familiar. I can't remember the filmmaker's name, but they did an optical printer scene of To Kill a Mockingbird where it repeats the movements back and forth over and over and over again, kind of just still two image motions, but it really like lets you kind of see the scene in a different light than you would if you saw it all the way through without it kind of going back and forth, as well as so it really reminds me of that, which is really beautiful.
Yeah, I'm really glad that you saw that connection. The director that I think you're referring to is Martin Arnold. I believe he's an Austrian experimental filmmaker. And he was a really big inspiration to me. And certainly, the type of investigations he was doing with cinematic history was had a really big impact on me in terms of looking at a very, it's almost like taking a magnifying glass to cinematic history, right? And looking very closely at just a second or two of film to sort of unpack it, to sort of bring out the sort of latent information and effects that could happen at the micro edit level. So certainly that was a big inspiration, but also the work of Ken Jacobs, very famous experimental filmmaker. I had seen a film that he had made at one of the Whitney biennials. I think it's called Flo Rounds the Corner. Flo is the name of his wife, his partner. And it was a simple film, it was a short film, but it really inspired me to sort of investigate the use of repetition and very short editing in order to sort of investigate the apparatus itself, right? The mechanism that allows us to see or experience the illusion of movement in cinema, like really sort of investigating that and experimenting with it. I see you have a link here to Flow Rounds the Corner. So yeah, this piece is really sort of the genesis for my inspiration of Marvelous Creatures. Again, I don't know if we're really going to be able to see it on the internet because it's so quickly edited with these very quick micro edits that the throughput will not do it justice. But it's really sort of investigating the illusion of movement, what actually creates movement in cinema, and sort of playing around with it, breaking it, messing it up. But I think for me, I was interested in doing that and then adding the sort of conceptual level of cinematic history on top of that, and also alternation between different sources of imagery.
Let's go ahead and open it up to other questions. That was perfect. Thank you so much, AJ, for jumping in. Anybody else with questions? AJ, you can keep going. Oh, Nick has a question. After Nick. Okay.
Maybe to follow up more on Godard, maybe I guess my question would be, did Godard at all influence your editing styles? And in a way, your sort of way of capturing cinematic history and love for cinematic history in that way, in a way that's similar to the way he does, or in the way that you may like the way he does that.
Okay, yeah, thanks for that question, Nick. I don't think Godard has. Just on the surface, I can't think of a particular technique or approach to filmmaking on a technical level that comes from my experience of Godard. I think more on sort of the general level of a love of cinema history itself, and the use of quotation in his work. I think that really made a very strong impact on me. The incorporation of cinematic history within new cinema projects. I think that sort of demonstrated to me that there's a way of working with cinema that uses cinema as its content, the sort of history of cinema as its content. So on that level, I think Godard has been very influential, and I think he's been extremely influential on many filmmakers. But in that particular regard, that's how he's affected me, Nick.
AJ, did you want to go?
Sorry, I was looking at something. I enjoy that you have this connection between like the French new, like the breaking of the rules. I think of from theater, at least I think of like Les Cid and Cornier from early French theater, really trying to break the rules of that and how you can bring that into cinema. It wasn't a question. It was more of like a kind of just a comment again on how that really, I think that's really awesome. But I do actually, one thing I did want to ask is, how do you look at, when you look at like moments that you kind of want to do this, like Martin, like repeating back and forth or like going from one motion to the other, like what's your process of like choosing those tiny moments that you pick from?
It's really, I think it's driven by the sort of underlying ideas or concepts rather than any particular effect. Creating sort of oppositions or disruptions between different material. But just to speak to the practical dimension in terms of like how it actually happens, it's really just a matter of trial and error and doing very meticulous, lengthy experiments with fragments, working up with fragments to see what works, because you might have a great idea for something, and then when you actually do it, it turns out to be worthless, or it doesn't have the effect that you wanted. So you might have an idea for a particular juxtaposition or a certain experiment in terms of combining images and sounds, and then you do it. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't, but it always like allows you to move forward. Perhaps it inspires you to try something else, something new that you didn't originally think of. So it's really sort of a back and forth process of experimentation, trial and error. Marvelous Creatures took a very long time to edit, but not nearly as long as what Martin Arnold's work would have taken working in actual celluloid, right? He worked with an optical printer in making those early works that he's so well known for. By the time I was developing this experimental work, the sort of digital ways of working had already become available and accessible. So today, it's much easier to experiment at the micro level in terms of different patterns of editing compared to working with analog technologies.
I believe that AJ, this might even be a good technique for the one that you showed in narrative film production today, especially that shot with the hands and cutting back and forth potentially. And maybe that's why your interest in this, to do that micro edit. And I think inside your question, correct me if I'm wrong, AJ, is maybe how to do that micro edit. And what Wago is doing is actually going between elements. So from the lion to the wax museum person, but how is Martin doing it with the micro edit to make it seem like that movement? Is the aspect ratio being changed? Is there something with the optics that's being changed, or the light, so that it seems like it's moving? I think there's something in that, right, AJ?
Yeah, I was actually going to ask you if you did anything similar to, if you did work analog at all on this, or if you did it all digitally. So I appreciate you that. But yeah, I just was interested in seeing how you kind of like try to relate one motion to the next with your images. I can't remember it. I saw it really briefly, but I think you answered my question well. How to do the edit? The trial and error. I think that's really fun.
AJ, getting back to some of your comments about Martin Arnold's work, there's arguably there's an effect in some of his films that's almost like the scratching of a record. When a DJ takes a record and sort of moves it back and forth on a turntable, and starts moving it forward and then moving it back, and creating this sort of back and forth movement. There's a certain rhythm and a play with time that's absolutely fascinating, right? In itself, regardless of what the content is. I've done other pieces that are very similar to this sort of gesture, in which I scratch an object or a human figure that is in movement to sort of create this sort of back and forth movement. And there's almost a direct gestural connection between the movement of the timeline on a nonlinear video editing system and this sort of analogous scratching of the record that takes place in hip hop, for example. And I think that's really fascinating. I've done a few experiments, but I haven't really gone further into that. But Martin Arnold is so fascinating because he was able to create that illusion, that effect, but he had to like sort of plan it all ahead in his head. He had to like write down exactly how to create these effects ahead of time and then program them into an optical printer. So that type of process could take years of work as opposed to weeks in working digital.
And I noticed that you said that each of your clips were 5 frames.
5 frames long each. Yeah, exactly 5 frames long.
Yeah, and Martin's work, I'm calling him by his first name. His work, he like really plays around with that timing of each clip being like different lengths to like extend those moments. So did you play around with that length, the clip length, and like what made you like say like, okay, five frames is it for me?
Yeah, in other works, I've played with duration of loops and repetition, but in Marvelous Creatures, I sort of set as a rule for myself that every shot was going to be five frames long. I sort of gave myself that restriction ahead of time. And in any sort of creative endeavor, if you give yourself a restriction, a self-imposed restriction, that opens up the possibility for new discoveries, right? Because you have to resist that sort of restriction. You have to push against it. And by having boundaries, it opens up the possibility for new discoveries. So that was my strategy, was to constrain myself, to not allow myself to play with duration, to set a set length for every shot, and then work within that framework and to see where that led me.
Any other questions? Marcus, Leah?
No, I don't think so.
Leah says this has been a great talk, and yes, it has been. Thank you so much, Professor Kreider, for joining us in this Conversations, Art and Cinema. Fantastic stuff. I'm very inspired, and you saw I kept trying to play the Truffaut to get it in there, and it's that music that haunts me. And so that's sort of the point I wanted to make, that I find your work very, very inspiring, and I'd love to myself try to do something in this vein, or try to make an in-between with something like a 400 Blows in Paris. That might be very exciting for me, and I'd love to share it with you at some point. So I'd like to thank Professor Kreider and thank all of you for joining us today. And I can't wait to edit this and share it with the entire university. Thank you all so much.
Thank you so much, Pirooz.
Thank you, Wago. Thank you.
Thank you, Wago.
Take care.